Hello, everyone, after the break, and welcome to today's afternoon panel of awesome Agile by Example speakers. My name is Magda, and I will be your host for the next few hours. First up, as our speaker, we have Viktor. Well, Viktor, while he's been coaching for over a decade now, when asked, Viktor doesn't really know why he became an Agile coach in the first place. He noticed that he was more useful to his context as a coach and continued doing so. And the coach role offered him the opportunity to think, observe, and learn. Well, as far as I can say, these are Viktor's main motivating factors: thinking, observing, learning, and practicing creativity. Well, what interested me the most about Viktor is that he has a devoted thinking time in his calendar, which he doesn't use for anything else than just thinking. Well, you won't find him in any context where the need is for resource to implement predefined solutions. Co-learning and co-creation drives him. And today he's going to talk about how he works with his context through informed interventions. So if you have any questions, feel free to write them on Slack in main Pink Room channel. Viktor, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Magda. And thank you for having me here. I'm delighted to speak about informed interventions. It's a topic that I care deeply about. And this talk has had a few different names over the years. I've called it strategic interventions, and I've called it evidence-based interventions, but I don't think that those titles really fit what I'm talking about. And when I was reading Esther Derby's book, the last time I reread it, her new book about productive change, I came across the expression informed interventions. And I think that really captures what I see my role as. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And I think that, like, a question that every coach or scrum master, like, I'm just going to be calling everyone coach from now on, but like anyone who works with change, right? So a coach, a question we really need to think about is like, what are our interventions based on? So when we make an act to modify something, what is that act based on? And the message that I want to relay with this talk today is that our interventions need to become about completely other things than enforcing Agile. The Agile part of coaching Agile needs to be much smaller, proportionately. Now, this might be because Agile has become like commodity. Everyone knows kind of what it is. But it's also, I think, because the problems that Agile originally solved, many of them have been solved. And so now we have other problems to solve. And we can't do it by using Agile. I think a couple of reasons, I'm going to go through a couple of reasons why we're having these issues where, like, we have coaches making interventions that are not informed. I think one is that the Agile coach role has become a specialist role. It used to be a generalist role where you had lots of experience from different roles and or even professions. And that all came together as a role, and it might have been called a project manager, a product manager, or engineering manager, or a director, or it could have been called like an Agile coach. But what you were doing was you were coaching on broad topics. And now it's become this entry-level job, entry position. And the way you get it is through these certifications. And the trainings are really oriented around these things that are easy to learn, like what is Agile, how long is a sprint, and what does a stand-up look like? So the Agile coach role has become a specialist role. And that's, I think, exacerbating the problem. Because when we expect specialists to do this, like broad coaching or like generalized coaching, and we don't teach ourselves who are coaches to understand their own personal limitations, we get dogma. So we get this dogmatic coaching. And I think that that's where we are at as an industry, like dogmatic coaching. Now, when I say dogmatic, some might get this picture in their mind about this, sweaty man or sweaty person with lots of energy and enthusiasm, really pushing their message. And that's certainly one way that dogma can look, but that's not what I'm referring to. Like, for me, dogmatic coaching is just where you're coaching any belief you have with unquestionable certainty. So you could be a very calm person and still do this. And most of us, I think, do this. And I've done this a lot in my past. And so one thing then you might be wondering, like, oh, do I have like dogmatic tendencies? And so like, how can I recognize if I have that? And so I just wrote down a few different thoughts that you might get, or clues that hint that you have some dogma. And everyone does, and it's not good or bad. It's just, if you recognize it, you might be able to get out of it. But so like, if you find yourself often thinking like, oh, why doesn't this team do story points? Or if you're on the other side, like, why don't they, how do I get them to stop doing story points? Or why aren't they doing 2-week sprints? Or why aren't they doing sprintless? Or like, why do I always have to remind them of the definition of done, or like whatever? Like, why do I always have to remind them to think about the dependencies, or whatever? Like, how do I get things to happen without me being there? Or if you find yourself with thoughts like, oh, this wouldn't be a problem if they were only so mature. The maturity is the problem. Like, these are clues that might indicate personal dogma. On the other hand, there are also some solution-oriented dogma signs. And I think that like, if you find yourself thinking consistently like, oh, let's train them in, or I'll send them this article and then everything will be great, or like, I'll make the learning a game and then that's going to be fun, or like, oh, they just need to try the thing that I know is great, and if they try it, it's going to be super good. These are signs, I think, of dogma coaching rather than informed interventions. And if you want to know a little bit more about how you reason about things, there's a blog post you can read from Wait But Why. And it talks about the thinking ladder, with high rung thinking where you're really looking for the truth, and then low rung thinking, which is more like automated thinking. Okay, but so like, one other thing that makes this a little bit difficult is the types of requests that we get as coaches. So when we go into an organization, like, how does the organization greet you? Well, you know, a common way we get requests is, hey, Viktor, I'm so glad you're here because this team is not doing Scrum. So that's kind of the instruction you get, or like, it's just a negation of state. It doesn't say anything. Okay, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? You know, there's no context whatsoever. And so if you are someone who has this, if there's a perfect or imperfect match, I don't know how you want to call it, but like, let's say you're someone who loves Scrum, and there's this VP saying, oh, these teams aren't doing Scrum. Then you start going there and you install Scrum. You're going to get a really happy VP, and you might get promoted. And you might think it's because you're coming there with solutions, but the teams might not be happy, and it might not solve their problems because it wasn't about Scrum all along. So like, this positive feedback loop is established between the coach and the manager if they meet each other on this like dogma. And that's bad. Or it's certainly not helpful for your career or the teams, at least. Now, another way we get instructions is like, hey, Viktor, I want you to help this team with prioritization through the Kano model. So like, install Kano in this team. And again, we have no idea what that is. And if you're a new coach and you just like learned about these aspects, you're probably like dying to try many of them out. So you're like, oh, great, I get to try design sprints. And so you go to this team and you try these design sprints, or whatever like methodology or practice that you want to learn about. Sometimes you find people who, or sometimes you find yourself in a situation where like a manager comes and says, hey, can you fix the reason for why, for example, this team is not meeting their sprint commitment? Now, the good thing is about this is that at least they know that they don't know what's happening or why something is happening. Now, the bad part is that they think that there's one reason. And then occasionally you'll find yourself in a situation where you're presented with a hypothesis. Now, this is a good place to be in because this is something you can test. Now, suddenly you can test, and it both invites testing and it also invites co-exploration, like conversational co-exploration. And then depending on how far up in a company you get, like if you speak to a CEO, for example, you might find yourself in a situation where they're like, hey, Viktor, something is happening or it isn't happening. I don't know. Half of the organization is saying this is a good thing. Half of the organization is saying it's a bad thing. I don't really understand. Can you just help? Can you come in here as an objective person and, you know, just tell me kind of what I need to think, how I need to think about this? And this is also like a better place to start off than X is not Y. So I thought I'd walk you through a few different examples of how we can make informed interventions. Now, the opposite of informed interventions, I say, is dogmatic interventions, because I don't think it's intuitive interventions, because intuition can be really helpful. And I don't think it's idealistic interventions, because you can be idealistic but still be open to truth. But like dogma, when you're not open to questioning, that's when we get into problems. So I was approached by this one PM, this product manager, and he said, hey, Victor, we have stand-ups, we have a big team, stand-ups are taking too long, they're taking about an hour. Can you just hold an agile training so that the stand-ups go faster? So that's the, can you do X and Y? And I said, well, I can observe the team and we can explore together what's happening. And so I sat down by the team in this area. This is their board, that's my chair to the left. I was sitting there anyway. And so I said, I observed them. And after a week, I'd say, I'll tell you what I've seen after a few days or a week, if something becomes apparent to me. And so I sat there, it's a big team. And one way to think about this is it's a big team, and therefore the stand-ups take time and we should split the team. But we couldn't split the team, and I knew that because I'd been there from the inception. Because they were building new technology to support the teams that were building features. So they needed to collaborate in new constellations every week. But the reasoning was kind of like, they're bad at running stand-ups. And that's because they don't know Agile. And therefore you should train them in Agile. And so I went in and observed this team instead of training them in Agile. I didn't want to bring out 20 people to a half-day workshop about Agile. That felt really like, oof, I don't want to do that. But so after I watched them, I saw that they were standing in half circles around the board, and they would ask things. They would say like, yesterday I did this, today I'm going to do that, and I don't have any impediments, or I do have impediments. And to me, that indicated that, an Agile training isn't really going to be helpful because they already know that. So what should I tell them? Like, do it differently? Because when you talk about this standard Agile trainings, this is kind of what it's about, like just going through the basics. But what I did notice was that they were doing status updates individually. And so they were standing like in a half circle around the board, and person 1 would share, and then person 2, 3, 4. And then when person 5 would go, or 6, person 1 would suddenly remember something and say, oh, by the way. And so it would jump back and forth between people. And that took a lot of time. And what can you do here? Well, I could stop them from jumping back and forth. I could take the facilitator role. I could time box. Like, there are lots of things you could do here, but none of these seemed viable. But what we noticed was that the board, what we discovered was that after a few days, that the board was organized according to goals. And every week the team would swarm around those. So like who's going to be working on goal 1, who's going to be working on goal 2, etc. And there was no carryover backlog. So like there were weekly goals that they were working on. But we were asking people to report individually. So kind of like how people were asked to work and think about their work and how they were asked to speak about work was not aligned. And this was creating some problems. So what we did was we changed the format so that you share an update by per lane. So like what's happening here, and then one person could share or 2 people could share, and then they were done. So we just said, let's try this out. And we tried this out, and overnight the stand-ups dropped to 10 to 20 minutes. And there was no training here, and there was no real coaching. We just changed the form. I mean, that's the coaching, but there was like no going into like doing individual coaching sessions or mentoring sessions with anyone in the team. And I'm aware of the Hawthorne effect, like people you observe change their behavior, and that could have been the case. And so it's really important to continue to like observe afterwards. But this one intervention, after that one intervention, I didn't need to be there anymore. And that's one of the like insights, or that one of the important things with like observing something, is that you get insights, and those insights allow you to reframe. So it went from, stand-ups are taking way too long, train them in Agile, to, hey, we're asking people to do individual updates, even when they're working in groups, like they're thinking as working groups. So reframing opens up new possibilities. So that's where it's really important to be more informed. because you're going to get opportunity or possibilities that you didn't have. Another example here is a big organization came and said, hey, Viktor, our teams are slow. Can you help us make them faster? And so this is kind of like, okay, so there are 5, 6 teams, and there's a lot to explore here. And I was following this org around for 2 months. And that was lucky, because I noticed, so I went in and I looked at their processes, and, it was senior engineers, they were great, and they collaborated in different ways. They wrote high quality code. Like, there was nothing weird about those things, right? The products they created had high quality, really high quality. And I couldn't really assess whether something was slow or fast. But what I did notice at the monthly shift was that team composition changed. And it was just lucky that I was following this org around for over a month break rather than just 2 weeks during a month, because I would see that people would change. So this is their list of how many people that are assigned to the different teams. So each row is a team and each column is a month. So if you look at just this one example here, you see that team composition changes extremely much. So 1 month it's 7 people, and then the next month it's 3 people, and then the next month it's 9, and then 15. And a lot of tribal knowledge is lost, and the teams need to reset, and just have conversations that they wouldn't need to have normally. So focus shifted from task to people and process, essentially. Now, this insight for them opened up for other conversations, like, how do we create more stability for our teams? Maybe we don't even need that. So it also opened up for, like, what stability do we actually need for our teams? But from our team's performance is low to, like, we don't have stability, what should we do about it? That's a huge shift in the possibilities you have as a management team or a coach. So there's a lot of, like, observations and detective work that you need to do, I think, before you make these interventions in your organizations or teams. Okay, so you might think that, okay, that's great for a big organization, but, like, what about a team? Can you, like, observe that much? What data exists from a team point of view? And there's a lot of data that exists for teams as well. So one team came to me and said, hey, Viktor, our performance is low. Can you help us figure out why? Like, we tried to have conversations, we have the retros, we have the all agile trademark things we're doing, but performance is not going up. Like, we need your help. And so I followed this team around for a couple of weeks, and I had interviews with them, and I observed them in meetings. And, like, in the interviews, that was what was fun, or that was where some insights came out. And, like, some quotes from them is like, we're not making any progress, or I like our purpose and why we're here, but, like, I don't know what we're here to do exactly, more than, like, this big mission. And, like, I really like the mission, I like the people, but we can't get anything done, and, like, we're not delivering anything. And so then I started just asking them, like, what are the things that have a positive impact on your energy, and the things that have a negative impact on your energy? And so, like, talking about process, negative. Talking about goals or tasks, positive. And then, like, socializing without doing any goal talks or process talks was also positive. So then I brought up their calendars and I looked at them, and we could see that the majority of their meetings together were about process. So my suggestion here, which is kind of controversial, is let's just remove all the process talks. And we did. And that was a huge relief for this team. And it's not really necessarily something an Agile coach or Scrum Master might suggest to a team. Like, we're not going to try to continuously improve anymore. Although this is the continuous improvement, it is to actually, like, focus more on tasks, you might argue also. But so this allowed the conversations to shift from, like, our performance is low to we're not getting the context we need to solve customer problems. And this is something we can do something about. Okay, in the same group, because context was missing, we saw subgroups form. And this was also a problem that they didn't like. So they noticed that we have these exclusive and sticky subgroups, and they just won't go away. Like we don't collaborate across these subgroups. And if I would have met this team maybe 10 years ago, early in my career, my first instinct would have been, okay, we need to take an offsite. We need to get to know each other better across these different subgroups, and we need to have like a vision workshop and all of those things. But here I was a little bit more curious about the subgroups. So I did a network analysis of the team, and we looked at like what formations exist. And I'm using Game of Thrones names here. I'm going to change this to the Expanse names because I love the Expanse. But for now, it's Game of Thrones. But so we could see that this was who they interacted with. And what we could see also was that these subgroups that existed were based on who had known each other before they joined this team. So people who had worked together prior to joining this team were one subgroup, except for Tyrion, he was new. Now, when they saw this, one of their insights were like, oh, poor Tyrion, like we've done a poor job in onboarding him. And so they took care of that. They onboarded him. But another thing was like, rather than, oh, let's do an offsite, they started asking themselves, like, are there any problems that fit our existing subgroups? Like, rather than redoing everything, like, isn't there any work that fits these two groups? And the PM said, yes, actually there is. Like, here is two backlogs, two big problems that we could hand over to you, and they could get started on that. And that's also something you might notice when you're working with informed interventions, that not every problem is a problem. Like some things are just observations that can be turned into opportunities or possibilities. Okay, so moving on. Another organization came to me and said, like, hey, there's too little collaboration happening within teams. And between the teams, it's super fine, but within the teams, that's it's not happening, which is kind of odd because often it's the other way around. Like they're collaborating well within their teams, but not across teams. And so I wanted to map this out. So I asked the teams to plot out their dependencies, like what dependencies exist with between the teams. And we could see each line represents one dependency. We could see that there are a lot of dependencies here. Now, if I wouldn't have known this, one of the things I might have gone and done was to go into every team, like take one product area at a time and do like, we're going to do these workshops where we get to know each other, or we do working agreements and like collaborate more. But here, it has nothing to do essentially with the teams. We need to rethink the way we have organized work and organized teams. And so this turned it into like, what do we do with our dependencies? How do we want to treat our dependencies? Which is a bigger question, and you can't answer that from within a team. And so like not everything can be dealt from within the teams. And so that's also why it's really important to kind of have some data before you act. Okay, another few examples then. So like one thing I worked with, this was actually me saying this. This isn't the team saying it. I was thinking, oh, changes are taking too long. And I've done all these agile things and it's still taking too long. Like, why is it taking too long? And maybe as you can hear, this was me early in my career. And so what I did here was we successfully reduced the cycle time from 32 days to 5 days. But what we did was we just plotted, they were building data centers. And so what we did was we looked at all the steps needed from like a request or an idea to when it was a server was racked and operational. And what we could see was that between steps 3 to 8, there was this huge cycle time. And what we found out was that the reason, what's happening here is that when we install servers, we run out of network cables, these cheap network cables, you know, €5 network cables. And so engineers would go out to the data centers, try to install the servers, and then there would be no network cable. So they would just, oh, okay, I install it. I'll order a new one when I get back. And then when it's delivered to the data center, plus when we get back to the data center, like that time kind of amounts to 20 days. And this opened up for like, okay, but you know, network cables cost nothing essentially. And we have too little inventory. So that's the problem, not like things are taking too long, rather like we have inventory starvation. And so we just bought up a bunch of network tables and didn't run out of it. So that's also like what being informed opens up for, different options. Now, in linear systems, when you have a system where when you can assign causality, you have something called confounding variables. Like that's when you have one factor that affects other things. And when we work with team, this is the case all the time. Except it's not just one thing affecting X and Y, it's a lot of things affecting X and Y, and there are a lot of things affecting you, and there are a lot of things affecting that, because it's a system, right? And we can't predict how it's going to, we can't even figure this out in advance. So there's a lot of things happening, and that's why we can't just like go about and be sure about doing one thing and that's going to solve all the problems. One thing that was super surprising for one client was they came to me and said, hey, our teams are delivering components. Can you help us make them deliver customer value instead? Which is a kind of a reasonable thing to want, especially nowadays when all the competitors are having teams that are delivering customer value. And so we took John Cutler, he developed a product autonomy ladder. He's rebranding it to mandate levels now, but he observed that companies talk to teams using different mandate levels, or like they have different mandate levels in their conversations. And so we took that ladder and we looked at what autonomy do the teams have, where level A is very low autonomy. It's essentially telling a developer to like, can you write this code in this file or this repo? Make this one function in this repo here. And then, the highest level would be, we want you to increase our revenue 10% per year. And so we just took a small sample and we checked out, like, what is the autonomy in your work? Like, when people come to you with work, how do they express it? And to the left is low autonomy, to the right is high autonomy. And we could also see that essentially the blue represents people working in teams, developers, testers, designers, UXers, and then the red represented some sort of like leader, so non-individual contributor. And we could see that they were spread across the board, whereas individual contributors were always had lower autonomy. That was interesting. So we looked at this from a wide org perspective, and we could see that the entire org had scored very low. And so this allowed the management team to kind of get a new understanding of like, oh, we're actually asking our teams to deliver components. The problem isn't that they are delivering components. The problem is that we are asking them to deliver components. What should we be asking them instead? And I think that like we're past the point of lack of agile and knowledge being the biggest hurdle to overcome. So like as coaches, we can't make our role about installing agile anymore. I think if we do, I don't think this role is going to exist in 5 to 10 years, and rightly so. Like if we want to be helpful to our context, we need to be helpful to our context, and that is not agile, not anymore, maybe not never. Okay, so now you might be wondering, like, how do you do this? And I think that you need to adjust your engagement style to the context. And so from anthropology and ethnography, we can learn a lot about how to engage with a system. And we can have highly observational roles or highly participatory roles. And we can be in a visible researcher role or a less visible researcher role. When I was interviewing the team about their low performance, I was doing structured interviewing. So that's participatory and in a researcher role. It was very visible what type of role I had. When I was observing their calendars, or looking at their calendars, that was more in a highly observational role. When I was watching the teams in their stand-ups, I had a less visible researcher role. I was watching the events. And sometimes I facilitate events, so I'm in a participatory observational stance. And I think we need to learn these things, how to shift between these different ways of observing teams. So like, I really think that looking into ethnography and or ethnographic interviews and anthropology is a good idea for anyone working with teams. Or pairing up with a UXer. Essentially, how we want UXers to work with customers is how we need to be thinking more about our teams. So moving into summary, like I think that like when we're coaching systems, there's no place for dogma. But that's the place where I see a lot, especially of young professionals coming in, because that's what the training is oriented around. And I think like the important part here is you need to understand before you intervene, unless you know that you can never understand fully. So your intervention is about understanding. You want to see how something reacts. And then turn to anthropology and ecological models as opposed to like these popular management models. Anytime you see this 1, 2, 3, 4 profit models, that's when you should be really like cautious. Yeah, and I think that's it. So we can move over to Q&A.
Thank you very much for this awesome presentation, Viktor. So we had quite a few questions coming up during your presentation. So first of all was, how long do you usually observe a team before implementing or suggesting changes?
So there are two parts to that question. The first is like, how long does it take for me to get insights? And that can vary. It can vary between anything between a couple of days to months. It depends on how many iterations of the event that's happening. Now, the other question is, how long after an observation or like an insight would I turn to the team? And that also depends, but usually early on, because I'm not the one, unless there's like, oh, there's a huge problem with this thing. But like early on, once you have your observation, present it to the team. So you don't need to do it. I figured out something on a Wednesday, and I have to tell them now, but we have a meeting booked from Friday. I can't wait. That might be the case sometimes, but you could wait sometimes. But like after you have the insight, present it. But how long does it take to get an insight is completely up to what type of observation you're making.
Of course. And you said you're collecting insights. From who mostly do you collect the insights from?
That also depends on what I'm observing. So right now I'm running a study on leadership in one organization, and I'm interviewing everyone with a management position. Now, I could have taken the other stance and interviewed anyone reporting to a manager, and that would also have been interesting. But in this case, it was all the managers. In other cases, it's going to be other people. Sometimes it's not people either. Sometimes it's looking in a system. So you can, the example with team compositions changing, there I looked in the HR systems. So you can look at it, the source of data depends on what you're observing. And then if you're doing qualitative, where you're looking at people's experiences, or quantitative, where you're looking at aggregations, that's also very different. So I can't give you one answer to that. But I mean, if you look into ethnographic interviews and anthropology more, you'll get better at understanding when to use which model. And I'm also like a newbie at this. So like I'm speaking about it, it sounds like I know what I'm talking about, but like, I've been reading about this maybe for a couple of years, a little bit on the side, right? So I'm not any expert at it.
I see. And also have a follow-up question. So how do you know where there is enough observation not to bring your dogma into this observation? Where do you actually say, stop, that's enough?
It's a great question. I don't know. I mean, one part is like, once you have your observation. So I was in this one meeting with a management team and their middle management under them. And the middle management gave the management team feedback. And the management team deflected that feedback. And this happened over a couple of times. And so I would present this, and they would have these reasons for why the feedback was wrong. Now, here, I was kind of, I had integrity in my insights. So I wouldn't like budge, but sometimes you can present something prematurely and see what happens, and you can also change your mind. So I guess it's like, if you were to bet your money on something, what would you bet it on? Like, would you bet it on the future? Like this, if you have these, like, it could be this, or I have like, I don't know. Here's what I tell product managers. I think this might be what I'm doing. I've never got this question, so it's a good question. But like product managers, they ask like, how do I know when I'm done with exploring the problem space. Like, how do I know if I really understood the problem? And I usually say, when you can answer all the counter arguments, or you have like a compelling case to counter any counter argument. So if people come to you with like things that they say, oh, but it's this, and you can say, no, actually, it's not because of, or it's not because of. So if you have more of these answers to these challenges to your observation, then I'd say you're done. So, yeah.
What about situation when your intervention have not improved the thing?
Yeah.
Made things even worse? Do you have maybe example of a situation like that?
Yes, it happens. Yes. So this is also why, like, lightweight versus heavy interventions. I tread very lightly with. I try to make lightweight interventions and change by attraction, as like I've learned a lot from Esther and how she works with organizations. So when you work through attraction, like, your interventions can become more lightweight, and that's what I try to do. I try to generally avoid interventions that can have like this extremely negative impact. I've done that several times, where, for example, teams, I mean, it's not really because of me, but the intervention certainly didn't improve situations. So like, you might have a team with conflict and you're asked to intervene, and you weren't successful, and like a couple of the team members resign, or you tried this one exercise, or you tried splitting the team a certain way and that didn't make things better, it made them significantly worse. So yeah, when they become worse, I think if this happens a lot, it says something about how much information you use and your approach. But if it happens once or twice, you just reflect on what was it that you responded to, what was it that you were, what input did you get, what was your blind spot, and you try to move on from that. But I'm trying to think of like when I've made a catastrophic intervention, and I can't really think of a catastrophic intervention that I've made. So I'll have to ping me on LinkedIn afterwards, and we can, after some thinking, I'll find some examples. I'm sure. Yeah, well, I was thrown out. I was thrown out of a management team's meeting, and I was never allowed back in. I guess that could be an example for another time, though. But yeah, that was also early in my career.
It's also a learning experience whatsoever. If anything failed, just find a new way to make it work. So a bit of changing the subject, but still staying in the interventions. You talked about measuring autonomy in your team, and you asked the team to put somewhere, how do they feel on the autonomy level? So how did you actually approach measuring autonomy? Because that sounds like quite an interesting subject.
Yeah, so we did it in two ways. So we asked for a subjective evaluation. So we had John's product autonomy ladder with these general examples. And then together with the CTO, we came up with local examples of what that would sound like. So we had examples for every autonomy level that was local to that context. So everyone would understand, oh, I know what this feature was about because they worked there. So we had this context-specific autonomy ladder, and then we asked them to subjectively evaluate. But we also looked in Jira, and we just looked at how is work expressed and who creates it. But that was more just like doing some small tests to see. The bigger one was the autonomy, the survey, the subjective survey, the self-assessment, essentially. So aggregated self-assessment based on local examples is the answer.
Of course. Great. And we still have time for one more question. So what would be your advice to Agile coaches entering a new company?
Spend more time learning, like learn, observe. And like anything you say yes to should be about learning rather than anything else. So when I join a company, they might say, can you do this? Can you facilitate that? Can you run this? And I might say yes, but I don't take over any responsibility for driving something. So I'm handing out my CPU power while building up a database of events. So like be completely open to like get yourself completely immersed, like use immersed participatory actions as a way to observe, but also use the researcher role, like observational role, and then start collecting events to build your own database of things that you're noticing.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Viktor, very much for this talk and explaining and answering our questions thoughtfully.
It was a pleasure being here. Thank you for having me.